Hello and welcome back to the Sinobabble podcast. In today's episode, we are finally going to be talking about the Taiwan, China, US issue. I've been teasing this for a few weeks. There was a lot of reading to do, so the wait is over. Also, I feel like this is going to be a slightly longer episode than the usual half an hour or so that I've been doing more recently. This is going to be more like the good old times when the episodes were like 45 minutes or an hour long, so you can all get comfortable and look forward to that, I guess. For those of you who can't see me, I'm drinking a bubble tea in, I don't know, I was going to say in solidarity with the people of Taiwan, but I don't think that makes any sense. I think I just really wanted a bubble tea. So yeah, today's episode is going to be about whether or not the US and China will go to war over the Taiwan issue. I think I'm going to choose a relatively provocative title for this, nothing too clickbaity, but essentially I'm going to give my reasons for why I don't think that they will go to war over Taiwan. This is all my opinion, obviously based on the reading that I've done, and I'd be curious to hear if you guys had any other opinions about this or any other arguments, any other good reading that you've seen, and you can share that with me and also the other people listening or watching to this podcast as well. I think there's been a lot of growing general awareness about the situation of Taiwan, mainly as a result of relations between China and the US, not really because of Taiwan intrinsically. Taiwan's always been kind of a low-key important geopolitical player, and even though for the past 70 or so years it has been in this very tenuous relationship with China, I think most of the Western world isn't very aware of that. So I'm going to kind of try and break down a little bit before we get into the reasons why I don't think that the US and China will go to war over this issue. I want to break down a little bit what Taiwan's position is, who the Taiwanese people are, you know, what right do they have to say that they're a country or a nation state and things like that. So let's give some cultural context, some political background on this stuff first before we get into the reasons why we should be trying to avoid World War III. So you may or may not be aware of something called the One China policy. This is kind of the set of ideas that keeps Taiwan in this very precarious position of non-statehood that it currently occupies. The One China policy, or the One China principle, is interpreted differently by all the different actors in this game, right? So according to the Chinese government, the One China principle states that there is but one China in the world. Taiwan is an inalienable part of China, and the government of the People's Republic of China is the sole legal government representing the whole of China. In Taiwanese politics, the One China principle has its own interpretation depending on which political faction that you're talking about. We'll get more into the politics of Taiwan a bit later on, but essentially Taiwan also agrees that there is only one China. The disagreement that they have with the mainland is which China is the real China, or at least that was the original disagreement between the two. More recently, there's been a push towards Taiwan is not China. Taiwan is just Taiwan. There is this unique Taiwanese identity. So Taiwan is actively trying to break away from this one China policy idea. It doesn't want anything to do with, say, the one country, two systems system that China promoted in Hong Kong that we've seen recently has kind of broken down into something else. So Taiwan kind of wants to avoid that same fate and forge its own destiny. But that's not a cut and dry issue. And yeah, we'll get into that a little bit later on. The One China policy in the US, it goes something like, the United States acknowledges that all Chinese on either side of the Taiwan Strait maintain that there is but one China and that Taiwan is a part of China and does not challenge that position. So I think this is something that people don't know, or they get a bit wrong about how the US relates to Taiwan. Some people think that the US sees Taiwan as a country. It doesn't. There were 14, but now there are only 13 countries that recognize Taiwan as an actual state, as China, if you will, the Republic of China. However, the US actually acknowledges that Taiwan is a part of China. They also agree to refrain from supporting Taiwan if it were to seek sovereignty or permanent separation from mainland China. I did an episode on the Chinese Civil War, a few episodes actually on the Chinese Civil War, the US's support for the KMT over the CCP during that. So if you want to understand why exactly it is that the US supports Taiwan and not China, and yet still has this kind of weird relationship with Taiwan where it can't really acknowledge that it is China. Just hop back to that episode. I'll try and remember to link it down below as well if you want a bit more context about how Taiwan even came to be in the first place. So that's the three-way relationship. And so before we talk about the potential for devastating warfare, I thought it might be useful to kind of touch on Taiwanese cultural politics very briefly and sort of give some context for Taiwanese identity as well. As we know, or as we should know, Taiwan is a very new country. It's also a democracy. I think it's also very obviously a state, right? So we should kind of get that out of the way. Taiwan is Taiwan is a country. It has its own currency, it has its own flag, its own national anthem, its own government. It's even got its own Olympic team, right? So Taiwan is not just a place, it is a functioning society. It's much more functioning than other countries that are recognized. We kind of spoke about this in last week's episode about world peace, where you have states that are to all intents and purposes states because they have a boundary around them, but the internal conflict is so deep. It might be recognized on a map, but the government doesn't function. The place is under constant duress or civil war. You've got countries like the Congo that, you know, they are technically countries, but Taiwan is way more of an actual functioning country than a lot of these places. So the problem is not how Taiwan is constituted, but rather whether or not that constituted state identity can be absorbed into mainland China and what is preventing that absorption. Here we're getting into the question of what is identity, what is culture, and why is Taiwanese identity different from China, and how is that preventing the reunification of the two? So Taiwanese identity has morphed over time, basically due to an influx of different governing systems. So you had the migrant Han Chinese coming in during the Qing regime, and then you had the period where Taiwan was ruled over by Japan after 1895. Then you have the imposition of authoritarian or a different authoritarian rule under the KMT after 1949. So this shifting of political systems had a similar effect on the social makeup of society, right? According to Melissa Brown in her book, Is Taiwan Chinese?, she explains the development of Taiwanese cultural identity as follows. Before 1895, people in Taiwan did not think of themselves as a unified group. Although Han in Taiwan undoubtedly viewed themselves as different from non-Han, there is no evidence of unity among the Han. In the 17th century, Han merchants warned the Dutch about an uprising of Han farmers and labourers, showing class rather than ethnic solidarity. From the 17th to the 20th centuries, while some Han cheated Aborigines of their land and rents, other Han married Aborigines and helped them rebel against abuse, showing solidarity along the lines of personal connections and common economic interests rather than ethnic identity. Under Japanese colonial rule, peoples in Taiwan were classified by notions of race. The Japanese government distinguished between the Hoklo and the Hakka, regional varieties of Han, and distinguished barbarian Aborigines as raw or cooked, depending on their relationship to Han culture. In 1945, Taiwan was gloriously returned to Chinese rule. Corruption was rampant at all levels of government and the military, inflation skyrocketed, and the mainlanders kept coming. Tensions led to Taiwanese uprising, referred to as the 228 incident in 1947, brutally suppressed by the KMT. Under martial law until 1987, Taiwanren was used to refer to those whose ancestors had come to Taiwan prior to 1895. During martial law, Taiwanese were largely excluded from political power and national corporations, and mainlanders were largely excluded from small and medium-sized businesses. Taiwanese also excluded mainlanders from their social sphere where they could. So as you can see, there's lots of overlapping identities happening in Taiwan, and the intermarriage of these different groups, you know, like the first mainland Chinese arrivals in the 19th century, mixing with the Aborigines, mixing with the next influx of mainland Chinese people, creates a very unique cultural system. And as we saw as well, economics and class also play a very important role in that. By the time you get to the early 21st century, Taiwan is way more similar to somewhere like South Korea or Japan than it is to China. China doesn't even have those cultural identifiers that Taiwanese Han people would say makes them Chinese. So, for example, the Confucian work ethic, which was erased during the Cultural Revolution. In the 21st century, as Taiwanese people get democracy, they also somehow become more independent of the Chinese idea of nationalism and start to form their own nationalism. And increasingly, we're seeing that the pluralism of democracy is allowing a pluralism of ideas of what it is to be Taiwanese, how to deal with China, how to deal with mainland people coming into Taiwan, how to keep, say, China close economically or at an arm's length politically. You're getting a wider variety of ideas in that space. Whereas before, under KMT rule, it was kind of just like, well, if China does reunify with Taiwan, it's just a case of one authoritarian government replacing a different authoritarian government. So there was less room for debate, there was less room for comment or skepticism or questioning. Now it's a lot more complex as this new political, social and cultural and even economic identity has risen up. According to Yun Han Chu and Ji Wen Lin, with the demise of KMT authoritarian rule came a vibrant Taiwanese nationalist movement with growing and broad-based social support. The popular aspiration for an independent Taiwan became increasingly crystallized and cohesive at the close of the 20th century. Most significantly, with the indigenization of KMT power structure, the state was eventually converted from a cultural agent of Chinese nationalism into an incubator of a reimagined community based on a new Taiwanese identity. So, bearing all of this in mind, why is it that we can't give up on the idea that Taiwan is part of China, even today, even as Taiwan's identity, its cultural uniqueness, everything that, we consume from Taiwan, from its food to its like cinema and music, these are all very distinct from those of the mainland. Why do we see them not only politically, but also academically as still part of China? When I was active in the academic space, when I would go to conferences about China, there was always a panel on Taiwan. And it wasn't a panel, say, about the Taiwan question, so to speak. There was things in there about Taiwanese cinema, Taiwanese music, Taiwanese culture. It wasn't antagonistic, and often you had mainland Chinese scholars speaking on these issues as well because of increasing cultural and academic exchanges. When I was in Hong Kong, and most of my colleagues were mainland Chinese people, we actually organized amongst ourselves an academic conference with a Taiwanese university, and we all went to Taiwan together, and it was all very cordial. So clearly there's, when we went, we were all speaking Mandarin to each other, and it was weird. We would play games, or they would play games because I didn't really get these, but the Guess Who game where you stick a name on your head and you have to ask like 21 questions or whatever the game's called to try and guess who you are. And they could all play because they all had they would come up with these characters. I'd be like, I don't know who that is. And it's like, oh, well, we learned about it in school. So they even have similar educations, right? And similar historical understandings of what it is to be Chinese or to be Han. The Taiwanese identity is very new. And for China to give up on that and to let Taiwan go would call into great question the legitimacy of the CCP's sort of grand national narrative. Part of the reason that Taiwan is so integral to China is because it's kind of the last place that was taken away from China's perspective by imperial powers, especially during China's century of humiliation in the late 19th, early 20th century. Also, if Taiwan were allowed to cede, so to speak, from the Chinese empire, then that sets a precedent, right? Why not the Uyghurs of Xinjiang? Why not the Tibetans? Why not the Cantonese in the south of the country? It's very obvious that what it is to be Chinese, it's a lot deeper than ethnicity or shared cultural or economic present conditions. Why is it that when you have Canadian athletes with Chinese surnames competing at Olympics who have never been to China and don't speak Mandarin and are 2 or 3 generations removed from anything to do with China, they still get cheered on by their Chinese compatriots watching? It shows that for China, there's something a lot deeper. There's a historicism there that makes the idea, the essence of Chineseness transcend modern geopolitical, economic, military, whatever it is, issues. It goes beyond that. It's deeper than that for China. For whatever that reason is specifically, they cannot let Taiwan go. So, with all of this context in mind, we can now move on to the actual question of this podcast, which is, why will China and the US not go to war over Taiwan? I have 5 main reasons. We're going to run through them. We're going to take our time. So I thought I'd start with the obvious reason first. We would all die if China and the US were to go to war in general, but also specifically about Taiwan. We would definitely all perish, or all of us. It would be very, very bleak. If China and the US went to war, this would be the first time that 2 major nuclear powers have gone head to head with all of the modern military capabilities that we have today. So this is like AI-powered superjet drones and long-range land and air missiles and, super silent stealth aircraft and space surveillance, all of this stuff that, means that you can kill people very efficiently and quickly and quietly. Both sides have this huge destructive force behind them that would enable them to just basically decimate really, really big parts of the global population in like a matter of weeks, I would say. So I did some looking up of stuff just to get an idea of what are the military capabilities in reality of both of these powers. The US has roughly 1.8 million military personnel, like ready to go, 13,000 aircraft, 11 aircraft carriers, 92 destroyers, and 62 submarines. China has about 3 million military personnel, about 3,000 plus aircraft, 2 aircraft carriers, 50 destroyers, and 78 submarines. So I don't know much about how military stuff works. It seems to all balance out when you add everything together and sort of divide it by 2, I suppose. I didn't include Taiwan here because, let's face it doesn't matter if Taiwan is ready to fight, if the US isn't there on day 1 when China invades, right? The battle would be lost before it even began. Looking at the military sort of capabilities of each side, it's kind of a superficial way of evaluating what would happen if the 2 sides went to war. But luckily someone's done that for me. So the Center for Strategic and International Studies has actually published its war game to study the outcomes of a conflict if China were to launch an invasion of Taiwan, specifically by sea. And it ran this simulation 24 times and came up with the following conclusions. The study found that while an allied force of US, Taiwan, and Japan was able to beat China in most scenarios, the cost was incredibly high. All sides would lose dozens of ships, hundreds of aircraft, and most importantly, tens of thousands of servicemen. Taiwan's economy would be completely devastated. The US would lose its global position potentially for the foreseeable future. China's political system would be completely destabilized. It basically concludes that, in all cases, the US should pursue deterrence over conflict to avoid complete international disaster. This study was also based on a huge number of assumptions, which just adds to kind of the depth of the problem that we're facing here. It assumes that the US would not strike the Chinese mainland, that Taiwan would start the war with everything that it needs militarily, that the US fleets are in the region and just ready to pop off at a moment's notice, that Japan will actually make its naval bases available for Allied use, that Taiwan does not immediately capitulate to China, and that neither side uses nuclear weapons. This study also doesn't include other simulations that were run. For example, the US Department of Defense has done their own simulations, but they are not available for public consumption. However, we do know that from the results of some of these that they show that the US will often lose unless it resorts to nuclear warfare and attacks the Chinese mainland directly. Not only do these studies show that there is actually a potential for the US and Taiwan to just lose in general, but whether they win or lose is kind of irrelevant because the military, economic, social, industrial complexes of pretty much all 3 countries and potentially other countries in the region would be completely devastated. And then, of course, this would have ripple effects, not just through the APAC, Indo-Pacific region, but all over the world. I mean, just taking China, they're hugely important in the export of raw materials like iron and steel, finished goods like pretty much everything that we use on a day-to-day basis, and vegetables as well. I mean, you think that food prices and the cost of living is high now, like wait till China can't get anything out of its country. Like that's when real problems are gonna start to emerge. And I don't think that we should ever assume that a country will not use nuclear powers. I wasn't around during the Cold War, but as I understand it, people were generally quite terrified that at any moment the mutually assured destruction scenario would lead to the devastation of the entire planet. There is that saying as well that I don't know what we're going to fight World War III with, but World War IV will be fought with sticks. That's definitely a situation that we could see here. If China and the US start fighting, everyone's going to be dragged in and it will turn into World War III. And if you think that that's an exaggeration, I will remind you that World War I started because one heir to one throne of one European country was shot by one random Serbian terrorist, and then that threw the entire world into chaos. That conflict didn't start between the two foremost powers in the world, but this one will. And if you think that that won't drag every other country in the world into the fray as well, I think you're not living in reality. I don't think any of us can afford for China and the US to go to war for any reason. Bringing the scale sort of back down to what the more local effects of a war would be, I think that China can't really afford to invade Taiwan militarily anyway, which brings me nicely onto my third point, that any military invasion of Taiwan would be a Pyrrhic victory. This is actually that's something everybody agrees with. For example, as one article puts it, numerous war simulations, track 2 crisis management discussions, and detailed assessments of military capabilities on all sides clearly show that a war over the island would result in a Pyrrhic victory regardless of which side prevails. The question is, what would that Pyrrhic victory look like if the results of the war were just isolated to Taiwan? For example, say China wins, but they've had to bomb Taiwan for any reason. Why is that important for the rest of us? And the answer lies in a very small, very not well understood piece of technology known as a semiconductor, or more colloquially, a chip. I'm not going to sit here and pretend to be an expert on semiconductors. That would be a lie. I probably know as much about them, generally speaking, as the average person. However, for the purposes of this episode, I've done a lot of reading about this because apparently we all rely on Taiwan a lot more than we probably know. So, in his book Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology, Chris Miller writes, "We rarely think about chips, yet they've created the modern world. America's military primacy stems largely from its ability to apply chips to military uses. Asia's tremendous rise over the past half-century has been built on a foundation of silicon, as its growing economies have come to specialize in fabricating chips and assembling the computers and smartphones that these integrated circuits make possible. Apple designs in-house the ultra-complex processors that run an iPhone's operating system, but the Cupertino, California colossus can't manufacture these chips, nor can any company in the United States, Europe, Japan, or China. Today, Apple's most advanced processors, which are arguably the world's most advanced semiconductors, can only be produced by a single company in a single building in the most expensive factory in human history, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, better known as TSMC. So, as I understand it, chips are used in pretty much every piece of technology today, from cars and refrigerators to smartphones and computers. So every single industry relies on chips in some way or another: military, communications, healthcare, education, even the food industry needs these semiconductors. And we are only becoming more and more reliant on them. So to illustrate how important Taiwan is to the semiconductor industry, Miller writes, Apple sold over 100 million iPhone 12s, each powered by an A14 processor chip with an 11.8 billion tiny transistors carved into its silicon. In a matter of months, for just one of the dozen chips in an iPhone, TSMC fabricated well over 1 quintillion transistors, that is, a number with 18 zeros behind it. Last year, the chip industry produced more transistors than the combined quantity of all goods produced by all other companies in all other industries in all human history. I have not fact-checked that, but I don't know what else we have that we have a quintillion of them. So that seems to potentially check out to me. I think something else that we should understand about the chip industry as well is that it's not just Taiwan that we're relying on here. There's a very delicate ecosystem supply chain that goes into creating even a single chip. And this is why it's difficult for, say, China to just come in and replace Taiwan as a chip manufacturer, right? Because you've got one country that designs them. Say in California, there's a company that will design it, and the machines that manufacture it come from Germany. The materials that make the silicon come from Japan. Then it's the actual transistor is made in Taiwan. It's shipped off to another Southeast Asian country to be tested, and then it's shipped to China to be put into an iPhone or a fridge or, I don't know, a smart car or whatever it is, right? But the chip has to make this long global journey before it even gets into the item. A war is going to disrupt that supply chain, right? That's what will be wobbled out of place. It's, as we saw in the pandemic, it's ships being stuck in ports. That is the thing that really starts to disrupt everything. So Miller goes on, when COVID slammed into the world in 2020, it disrupted the chip industry. Then, over 2021, a series of accidents, a fire in a Japanese semiconductor facility, ice storms in Texas, a center of US chip making, and a new round of COVID lockdowns in Malaysia, where many chips are assembled and tested, intensified these disruptions. Suddenly, many industries far from Silicon Valley faced debilitating chip shortages. Big car makers from Toyota to General Motors had to shut factories for weeks because they couldn't acquire the semiconductors they needed. Taiwan's economy obviously has other good bits to it other than the semiconductor industry, but this point I feel is illustrative as to why an invasion by China just wouldn't work. And I think even if they didn't have to invade, say by bombing the island, say they just kind of like marched in and took over without destroying anything, all it would take was one or two, maybe three really pissed off engineers in this TSMC factory to just sabotage the entire thing just because they were putting up a resistance to China. So you can't rule out things like domestic terrorism as well as a sort of middle finger to Chinese occupation if that were to happen. So it's actually in China's best interest as well to peacefully and happily welcome Taiwan back into the mainland family as a family member, as opposed to sort of like a rogue prodigal son that needs to be reined in. So how exactly can China do this? And this sort of brings me on to my third point, which is that China will not go to war with the US because China has its own plans for reunification with Taiwan. Whenever China makes threats or does like a military drill in the Taiwan Strait to sort of show that it's upset about naughty things that Taiwan's been saying about independence, those sorts of actions only further strengthen Taiwan's resolve or the Taiwanese people's identity and serves to sort of consolidate that identity and push China further away from Taiwan. If China wants to bring Taiwan back in peacefully and happily, they have a few other routes that they can take. And I've spoken about this in my newsletter before about how China doesn't really have a deadline, even though the longer that Taiwan stays a democracy, the further away these unifying ideals such as like, you know, remember the good old days of like the Qing dynasty or like the Civil War and, you know, one China, one peoples was a unifying ideal. As those generations who remember those feelings pass away and a new generation of Taiwanese identifying people is born, yes, China is going to be less able to bring Taiwanese people back into the fold based on these old historical sentiments. So what it has to do, in my opinion, is to forge new sentiments based on new reality. So one way that it can go about this is political. Something that China's been doing is sort of picking off the few remaining countries that actually recognize Taiwan as a country. The most recent examples are the Solomon Islands and Honduras. So I think it's actually the last couple of weeks, Honduras switched its recognition of China from the Republic of China to China, the PRC. We technically don't know why, but we do know that China has promised an undisclosed amount of aid to Honduras and has also promised to build a hydroelectric dam there. So I think perhaps some persuasive measures were used there. I think it's also another example of the issue we were talking about last week, where the sort of US influence economically is shrinking and countries are turning to China and sort of giving China what they want politically in terms of things like recognition in return for the economic aid that they haven't been getting from the West or other developed countries. So ironically enough, this is actually a tactic that China can use on Taiwan itself. And we've seen actually that Taiwan is becoming increasingly more dependent on China economically than it is, say, on the US. So for example, by 2014, 40% of Taiwan's trade was with the mainland, with 80% of the island's foreign direct investment going to mainland businesses. So you see that the two it's interconnected, right? It's not just flowing one way. Taiwan is both reliant on the mainland, and the mainland has got its claws into Taiwan as well. Taiwan has over 100,000 businesses set up on the mainland. There's been an increase in mainland tourists coming to Taiwan, which is obviously boosting local industry and local economies as well. China has also ensured that Taiwan is kept out of major economic pacts like the RCEP or the RCEP. And Taiwan's efforts to relocate investment elsewhere and become less dependent on the mainland, for example, in its 2016 new southbound policy, have yet to make any significant headway. As the US economic hegemony in the world declines and China becomes ascendant, it's going to be increasingly difficult for Taiwan to resist the pull back into the mainland. And because Taiwan is a democracy as well, this adds a layer of complexity because the two political systems are so different. However, at the moment, Taiwan's political system, like most developed democracies, is kind of pulled between two parties, a more democratic side or liberal side and a more conservative side. This kind of leads into the fourth point as well, which is Taiwan, as well as China, has its own plans. So I think something that kind of gets skipped over a lot when talking about the Taiwan-US-China issue is that Taiwan does actually have its own agency. And I think this is because we're often talking from the perspective of China versus US, and we don't really go down to Taiwan so everyone think sort of what do the people there actually think, what do the political and economic circumstances actually make possible for Taiwan's relationship with either China or the US. You know, if it came down to Taiwan, realistically, who would they actually choose? More and more would they choose China? That's the question that I think needs to be asked. In Taiwan, you've got this paradox where China is simultaneously the least and most important thing that Taiwanese people have to think about every day. Obviously, the question of when Taiwanese people travel abroad, they can't really say that they're from Taiwan because that's technically not a country. And then people ask them, oh, are you from China? And it's like, no, the Republic of China is not the same thing. The question of who are you fundamentally, it's obviously quite a big question, but that's mainly external to Taiwan. Taiwanese people on a day-to-day level, getting on with their regular lives, care about the same things that any of us care about when we're going about our daily lives. And increasingly, that is Taiwan's stagnating economy. The two main political parties in Taiwan, the KMT, which is the more conservative party, and the DPP, which is the incumbent party led by Tsai Ing-wen, they have to walk this very tight balancing act between promoting nationalism as far as they can and saying that they'll deal with the China issue, but also kind of not putting the China issue before everything else and dealing with people's real concerns, which increasingly does actually mean, okay, China is a potential ally in terms of the economy. Should we be promoting a pro-China stance in order to get the economic benefits of that? It's become very entangled at the political level. You would think that the KMT, being the ancestors of my favourite person, Chiang Kai-shek, would be more anti-China because, of course, the Civil War was the KMT versus the CCP. However, they actually have the label more recently of being very pro-China. Like most political parties, they are very factionalized within themselves. So you've got the party that wants reunification actively, and then you've got another party that wants a balancing act between the US and China, and then you've got the third and probably most popular side, which is like, we won't call it reunification, but hey, we have to, you know, take our relationship with China seriously. And they tend to be more popular with the more conservative members of the public who are very concerned with the economy and creating jobs and the continued vitality of Taiwan. Conversely, the DPP is very forthright in its attitude towards reunification. They don't dance the fine line like the KMT does. So, for example, in response to a 2019 speech by Xi Jinping, in which he declared that the Taiwan question was a Chinese internal affair, that unification under China's one country, two systems principle was the only option for the future, and that Taiwan independence was a dead end, the Taiwanese president, Tsai Ing-wen, responded that the vast majority of the Taiwanese people strongly rejected the one country, two systems, and that her government has never accepted the so-called 1992 consensus. The DPP has a problem where they're increasingly labelled anti-China. It's not necessary to say that this is like making them very popular. They only win by, it's like a 50-50 split, basically, in the votes between the DPP and the KMT. And it's not like the DPP have won every single election since democracy was introduced in the 90s. It's a genuine race. It's a genuine competition between the two. It's kind of similar to the situation you see in the US. Like, you don't really know if the Republicans or the Democrats are going to win from one election to the other. And when Tsai Ing-wen does things that are potentially seen as like igniting conflict, like for example, recently she traveled to the US. In the past, she's spoken with Donald Trump. In the past, Nancy Pelosi's visited Taiwan. These are all seen as sort of like crossing a line for China. And so it doesn't make the DPP very popular at home, because then you get the flybys by China. That's when the people feel most at risk. Right? It's in those actual specific moments. Another way that the border between Taiwan and China is being erased, we've spoken a little bit about the economy, but I think it's worth pointing out as well that from the Taiwanese perspective in particular, part of their identity in the past was formed on the basis that, well, China is this poor, underdeveloped place that's like under the yoke of like these really harsh authoritarian communists. People's living standards are so poor, we're nothing like them. But now that difference is being erased. If you travel between, say, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and a Chinese coastal city, there's hardly any difference between them, right? And you could, when I went to Taiwan, I actually noticed that a lot of the buildings were shorter than I thought they would be. There aren't a lot of skyscrapers in Taiwan like you would see in China. That basis for their identity, the idea that Chinese people have no work ethic and China is this poor backwater, that's being erased. And then continually you're having like these cultural, educational borders that are also being erased. I found some statistics about an increase in mainland students studying in Taiwan and vice versa. We see a steady increase from 2011 onwards, with an obvious drop during the COVID era. And also there was a ban put on the exchange of students, but that will probably be lifted, I reckon, in like a year or so. But the Taiwanese Mainland Affairs Council was actually very explicit in its wanting to attract mainland students to Taiwan and vice versa. So they say, the government's policy of allowing the recruitment of mainland students to study in Taiwan plays an important role in promoting the diversification of education in Taiwan. Through this exchange, the two sides can mutually learn and advance. This strengthens the competitiveness and expands the horizons of Taiwanese students. It also enables mainland students to experience Taiwan's multicultural development and share mainland China's experience during their time in Taiwan. This is conducive to the long-term peace and stability of cross-strait relations. Technically, the Taiwanese government is actually promoting the idea that Taiwanese people and mainlanders forget their differences and see their similarities, share their experiences, become more fluid in the sharing of their lives, essentially. Obviously, there are some problems that's caused by too open a border, right? So, for example, the fact that you see so much labor and like output and production shifting to the mainland causes a spike in unemployment in Taiwan. So I think overall employment is around 3%, but youth unemployment is around 12%. So that's not really something that young people are going to be happy about. Also, the educational integration between the two places is not complete. So, for example, medical degrees from Chinese universities are not recognized in Taiwan, and some Western universities have put bans on people wanting to seek further education degrees in their universities if their undergraduate degree is from a Chinese mainland university. So this is something that has the potential to put Taiwanese students off going to the mainland in the first place. However, it also has the potential to create a different result, which is kind of like a closed loop, right? So if Taiwanese students can't go further abroad, say to the US or Canada or wherever with their degree from the mainland university, they might just decide to stay in mainland universities to do further education or to work, because that's where the degree is recognized. And also as the cultural similarities between the two countries continue to increase, and if these cross-straits relations improve and younger people are studying in Taiwan or studying in the mainland and they understand each other better, it would be much easier for China to promote this idea of we're not so different after all. You may even see something like a work-study visa, where if you have studied in the mainland, you can stay there to work indefinitely without needing like formal approval, or, you know, maybe even like a dual nationality. It wouldn't be nationality, obviously, but, you know, like a passport system whereby if you've got an ROC passport, you are de facto recognized in China and you don't need all the visas that other foreigners would need, for example. I think something that might work out strategically for China is that as the border between the two places erases, you might get this critical max of the mixing of populations where it actually doesn't make sense anymore to be two separate countries. This is actually, as we discussed at the top of this episode, what happened in Taiwan in the first place. The reason that you have a unique Taiwanese identity is because the indigenous Aborigine populations mixed with the Hakka and the Hoklo Taiwanese people, mixed with the influx of Chinese migrants after 1895. So you have all these layers that mix in. If you mix in modern day mainland people, that's just another layer on top. And there's nothing to say that this couldn't, I don't know, when you mix two different colours together, say like blue and yellow, eventually they just mix together. There's no separation, you can't tell the difference. They do make a different colour, and, you know, Taiwan will always have its unique flavour, but it may well go the way of Hong Kong, where unique flavour or not, it's now been mixed into the whole. On to the final point of why I think the US and China will not go to war over Taiwan. This is potentially the most controversial point. Essentially, I don't think that Taiwan is a priority for the US, and I will explain why. First of all, the US has other priorities on its list. For example, the Russia-Ukraine thing that's going on at the moment. But even if we take that out of the equation and just focus on what are the flashpoints between China and the US, Taiwan definitely makes the top 5, don't get me wrong, but there are other things like China's geopolitical ascendancy in, say, the Middle East and Africa. You also have the AUKUS deal between Australia and the UK, which is sort of set up to help Australia improve its nuclear armament deterrent policy in the APAC region to make sure that the Western allies do not lose total importance and total ascendancy in that region versus China, which is obviously something that you see happening a lot more recently. China is also a player in the Russia-Ukraine war. Also, you've got the continued trade war, the continued economic war between China and the US. You've got things like the spy balloon, the TikTok. You know, there's just so much going on when you look at the buffet of China-US problems. Taiwan is definitely at the table, but I don't know if they've got the head seat. Another reason why Taiwan isn't, I don't think, the most pressing issue for the US at the moment is because for all the other issues, the US has to do something very active, right? For the Taiwan issue, they can continue to do nothing and the problem might actually resolve itself. Like I said at the top of this episode, the US's policy doesn't actually acknowledge Taiwan and acknowledge its right to independence. It actually acknowledges the opposite, which is that Taiwan and China are inextricably linked. However, China shouldn't invade militarily, but as long as everybody maintains that relationship, we're all cool with each other. One article sums it up very nicely as follows. The United States has seen China's commitment to peaceful unification as sufficiently credible to justify upholding its one China policy and limiting its military assistance to Taiwan, albeit in the context of continued arms sales to the island. Maintaining the viability of this US-China understanding requires the upholding of specific types of behaviour. Most importantly, Washington's scope of relations with Taiwan must remain limited to the unofficial level, defined in ways that are readily understood and accepted, especially by Beijing. In addition, Washington's resistance to any unilateral effort by Taipei to permanently separate Taiwan from China must remain credible. The US basically just has to continue as it is, and not do anything at all, even if Taiwan is chipped at bit by bit, whether that's losing recognition by different countries or continued economic integration with the mainland. If that actually happened and Taiwan joined up with China very smoothly in that manner over, say, the next 50 years, that would actually solve a huge problem for the US. That's not to say that there wouldn't be continued tension between China and the US. Of course, all of these other things would still play, but that's just, that's one bullet point ticked off the list, essentially. It's something that they wouldn't really have to worry about. Yes, okay, they would then have to worry about the expansion of China's sphere of influence in the APAC region, but they wouldn't have to necessarily worry about the imminence of World War III, which I think is probably the bigger of the two issues. I think in general, when we talk about China, Taiwan, US, when I was doing the reading, something that I noticed a lot is that a lot of these main talking points were formulated 30, 40 years ago, when Taiwan's economy and China's economy, and even the US's economy and military prowess and geopolitical importance were in very, very different places. They were almost reversed, right? You had US and Taiwan at the top, China at the bottom. Now China is not only level with the US. In the past 5 years, we've seen more and more that China is replacing the US. And then, of course, last week we also discussed about how China may even replace the commonly held notion of what it is to be somebody who can be an arbiter for peace, for justice, and facilitating the resolution of conflict worldwide. So if China can resolve conflict in the Middle East, an area in which it's had very little influence for the past 100 years or so, why would it not be able to resolve conflict with a part of its own country from its own perspective, right? I think that will be the next geopolitical challenge for China. In the case of Taiwan, again, going back to the question of how Taiwan views this whole issue, I don't think we should overlook the fact that the Taiwanese people will not be happy to be a non-state forever. At the end of the day, they're going to want it one way or the other. They're either going to want to become Taiwan, or, they might have to accept becoming part of China just so that they can live their lives not only peacefully, but easily, right? Why should they have to live and exist in limbo? We're seeing this sort of extremification of politics, especially in democratic countries all over the world, where you're getting increasingly polarized opposite ends of the political spectrums coming to force. So I think over the next 10 or so years, we might also see this in Taiwan as well. I don't know that much about Taiwanese politics, but I know that the new Taiwanese identity is something that's really only emerged over the last 20 or 30 years. And so that has the potential to become even more extreme, while the other side of the political spectrum becomes even more extreme in its pro-China stance, which some people do believe that it is becoming as the KMT becomes more resurgent. So how much choice Taiwan will have in whether or not it reunifies with China is not clear. However, I think we are getting to more of a crisis point. I think now more than ever, a decision will have to be made sooner rather than later. But I don't think it will come down to war. So that was my argument. Sorry that it was so long. That felt very long and very rambly and long-winded, but I hope I got everything across clearly. Like I said, I don't know everything about Taiwan, but I've been following this for a while and I've been doing a lot of reading in my own time. So I thought I would just share those points with you guys. Do let me know if your points, your ideas differ. If you've got anything to add to the conversation, if you've got a unique perspective, I would really love to hear from you guys. So do leave comments and write to me. Don't forget that this podcast has a newsletter as well, the Sino-Babble newsletter over on Substack, and you can read about different, more timely issues over there. I tend to write more about breaking news in that newsletter as opposed to the podcast, which is more about just like general concepts. So if you're interested in sort of discussing current affairs as they happen in China, I would definitely check out the newsletter. And if you'd like to support the podcast, don't forget that you can go over to Buy Me a Coffee and give either a one-off or a monthly donation. The link will also be down in the description if you feel like supporting my efforts. But that is all for this week, guys. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you in the next episode.